This is the seminar of Jacques Lacan, Book 1 by Jacques Lacan, Freud's Papers on Technique. This is Seminar 6, Discourse, Analysis, and Ego Analysis. This is exciting because this is the last seminar in the first subpart of this book, which is the moment of resistance. And the next seminar will be the topic of the imaginary, which I think will be fun. But this is Seminar 6, Discourse Analysis and Ego Analysis, with the sub-topic, maybe, Anna Freud or Melanie Klein. What I intend to do is to begin to draw you into the area marked out by the remarks I made last time. It is very precisely that area between the formation of the symbol and the discourse of the ego, and we have already been making our way into it from the start of this year. Today, I've entitled the seminar we'll be pursuing together, Discourse Analysis and Ego Analysis, but I cannot promise to live up to such an ambitious title in a single session. In opposing these terms, I mean them to take the place of the classical opposition between analysis of contents, analysis of resistances. In the text on the Verneinung that he kindly commented on for us, Monsieur Hippolyte brought out the importance of the complex meaning of Aufhebung. In German, this term signifies at once to deny, to suppress, and also to preserve through suppression, to raise up. We have here an example of a concept which cannot be pondered over too much in order to reflect upon what we do in our dialogue with the subject, as psychoanalysts have for some time noted. Part 1. Obviously, we are dealing with the ego of the subject, with its limitations, its defenses, its character. We have to get it moving. But what function does it have in this operation? The entire psychoanalytic literature is, as it were, at a loss over its exact definition. All the recent discussions which take the ego of the analysand to be the ally of the analyst in the great analytic work, capital great analytic work, contain quite obvious contradictions. Indeed, apart from ending up with the notion not only of the bipolarity or bifunctioning of the ego, but strictly speaking of its splitting, the radical distinction between two egos, it is very difficult to define the ego as an autonomous function, while at the same time continuing to regard it as a master of errors, the seat of illusions, the locus of a passion proper to it, one which leads essentially to misunderstanding. In analysis, as moreover in one major philosophical tradition, misunderstanding is precisely its function. There are paragraphs in Anna Freud's book, The Ego and the Mechanisms of Defense, where one has the feeling, if you overlook the sometimes disconcerting reifying character of its language, that she is talking about the ego with the same kind of understanding as we are trying to sustain here. And at the same time, one has a feeling that she is talking about the little man within the man, all hyphenated, who has an autonomous life within a subject and who is there to defend it. Father, look out to the right. Father, look out to the left, against whatever might assail him from without as from within. If we were to consider her book as a depiction of a moralist, then she incontestably is speaking of the ego as the seat of a certain number of passions, in a style not unworthy of the manner in which La Rochefoucauld points out the unflagging ruses of self-love. That's probably La Rochefoucauld. The dynamic function of the ego in the analytic dialogue, thus up to now, remains fundamentally contradictory for lack of having its place rigorously specified and this fact comes to the surface each time we touch on the principles underlying technique. I believe that many of you have read this book of Anna Freud's. It is extremely instructive and is easy to pick out on account of it being quite rigorous. Those points where the weaker elements in its argument appear still more apparent in the examples she gives. Look at the passages where she tries to define the function of the ego. In analysis, she says, the ego is only made manifest through its defenses, that is to say, insofar as it is opposed to the work of analysis. Does that amount to saying that everything which is opposed to the work of analysis is a defense of the ego? Elsewhere, she acknowledges that one cannot maintain this in that there are other elements of resistance than the defenses of the ego. Isn't that the way I began broaching the problem with you? Many of the problems we've taken up here figure in this book, and one should read it pen in hand because it has the status of a legacy, faithfully transmitted, of Freud's final detailed construction regarding the ego. Someone close to us in the Societe, seized at the 1950 Congress, I know not why, with a lyrical impulse, this dear friend, called Anna Freud the plumb line of psychoanalysis. Well, the plumb line doesn't make a building. A number of other instruments are needed, a water level, for instance. But in the end, the plumb line isn't that bad. It allows us to gauge the vertical of certain problems. I am going to ask Mademoiselle Jalinier to give you an account of an article of Melanie Klein's entitled The Importance of Symbol Formation in the Development of the Ego. I don't think reading one of Anna Freud's texts dealing with the analysis of children, and especially the ego defenses, can be a bad way of introducing it. Here is a small example she gives us. It concerns one of her patients, who comes to be analyzed on account of a state of acute anxiety which disrupts her life and her studies, all this to obey her mother. Her attitude toward me was friendly and frank, but I noticed that in all her communications she carefully avoided making any allusion to her symptom. She never mentioned anxiety attacks, which took place between the analytic sessions. If I myself insisted on bringing her symptom into the analysis, or gave interpretations of her anxiety which were based on unmistakable indications in her associations, her friendly attitude changed. On every such occasion, the result was a volley of contemptuous and mocking remarks. The attempt to find a connection between the patient's attitude and her relation to her mother was completely unsuccessful. Both in consciousness and in the unconscious, that relation was entirely different. In these repeated outbursts of contempt and ridicule, the analyst found herself at a loss, and the patient was, for the time being, inaccessible to further analysis. As the analysis went deeper, however, we found that these affects did not represent a transference reaction in the true sense of the term, and were not connected with the analytic situation at all. They indicated the patient's customary attitude toward herself whenever emotions of tenderness, longing, or anxiety were about to emerge in her affective life. The more powerfully the affect forced itself upon her, the more vehemently and scathingly did she ridicule herself. The analyst became the recipient of these defensive reactions only secondarily, because she was encouraging the demands of the patient's anxiety to be worked over in consciousness. The interpretation of the content of the anxiety, even when this could be correctly inferred from other communications, could have no result so long as every approach to the affect only intensified her defensive reaction. It was impossible to make that content conscious until we had brought into consciousness, and so rendered inoperative, the patient's method of defending herself against her affects by contemptuous disparagement, a process which had become automatic in every department of her life. Historically, this mode of defense by means of ridicule and scorn was explained by her identification of herself with her dead father, who used to try to train the little girl in self-control by making mocking remarks when she gave way to some emotional outburst. The method had become stereotyped through her memory of her father, whom she had loved dearly. The technique necessary in order to understand this case was to begin with the analysis of the patient's defense against her affects and to go on to the elucidation of her resistance in the transference. Then and then only was it possible to proceed to the analysis of her anxiety itself and of its antecedents. It's from Anna Freud, 1936, pages 36 to 37. What is at stake in what is here presented as the necessity for analyzing the ego defense? Let me say it as a question. What is at stake in what is here presented as a necessity for analyzing the ego defense? Nothing other than the correlate of an error. Indeed, Anna Freud immediately approached the material from the perspective of the dual relation between the patient and herself. She took the patient's defense to be what was its manifestation, namely, an aggressive act toward her, Anna Freud. It is on the plane of her own ego, Anna Freud's. It is within the framework of the dual relation with her, Anna Freud, that she perceived the manifestations of the ego defense. At the same time, she wanted to see it in a manifestation of transference, according to the formula which makes of the transference the reproduction of a situation. Although it is often given to the point where it is taken to be classical, this formula is incomplete, since it doesn't specify how the situation is structured. What I am now saying to you is related to what I pointed out in my lecture at the Collège Philosophique. Anna Freud started by interpreting the analytic relation in accordance with the prototype of the dual relation, which is the relation of the subject to her mother. She immediately found herself in a position which not only marked time, but was also perfectly sterile. What does she call having analyzed the defense against the affects? Following this text, there seems no other alternative than her very own understanding. This path would not take her very far. She should have distinguished between the dual interpretation, in which the analyst enters into an ego-to-ego rivalry with the analysand, and the interpretation which moves forward in the direction of the symbolic structuration of the subject, which is to be located beyond the present structure of the ego. Through this, we come back to the question of knowing what Beihang, what assumption by the ego, what yes is at issue in the progress of analysis. What Beihang should be elicited so as to constitute the unveiling essential to the progress of an analysand. In a passage to be found in the Outline of Psychoanalysis, page 40 in the French edition, but which is not outside of our purview since it is headed The Technique of Psychoanalysis, Freud tells us that is the ratification of a pact that determines the point of entry into the analytic situation. The sick ego promises us the most complete candor, promises, that is, to put at our disposal all the material which its self-perception yields it. We assure the patient of the strictest discretion and place at his service our experience in interpreting material that has been influenced by the unconscious. Our knowledge is to make up for his ignorance and to give his ego back its mastery over lost provinces of his mental life. This pact constitutes the analytic situation. Well, as my last lecture implied, if it is true that our knowledge comes to the rescue of the ignorance of the analysand, it is no less the case that we are also in ignorance, inasmuch as we are ignorant of the symbolic constellation dwelling in the subject's unconscious. What is more, this constellation should always be conceived of as structured, in accordance with a complex order. The word complex surfaced in analytic theory through a kind of internal force, since, as you know, it wasn't Freud who invented it, but Jung. When we get on the trail of the unconscious, what we encounter are structured, organized, complex situations. Freud gave us the first model of it, its standard, in the Oedipus complex. Those of you who have followed my seminar for some time have had the opportunity to see for themselves to what extent the Oedipus complex poses problems and to what extent it contains ambiguities, thanks to the commentary I made on those cases least subject to reservations on account of their having been so richly sketched in by Freud himself, namely, 3 of the 5 great psychoanalyses. In short, the entire development of analysis has resulted from showing to advantage, one after another, each of the tensions implied within this triangular system. This fact alone requires us to see in it something quite different from this solid mass summed up in the classic formula: sexual attraction for the mother, rivalry from the father. Rivalry with the father. You are aware of the profoundly dissymmetrical character, right from the start, of each of the dual relations included within the Oedipal structure. The relation linking the subject to the mother is distinct from that linking him to the father. The narcissistic or imaginary relation to the father is distinct from the symbolic relation, and also from the relation that we really do have to call real, which is residual, with respect to the edifice which commands our attention in analysis. All this demonstrates well enough the structure's complexity, and it is by no means inconceivable that another line of research will allow us to develop the Oedipal myth more clearly than has been done up to now. Despite the wealth of material which has been included within the Oedipal relation, the schema laid down by Freud can hardly be said to have been departed from. This schema should be kept to its essentials, in its essentials, because it is, and you'll see why, truly fundamental, not only for any understanding of the subject, but also for any symbolic realization by the subject of the id, of the unconscious, which is a self, soi-même, and not a set of unorganized drives, as a part of Freud's theoretical elaboration might lead one to think when one reads in it that within a psyche only the ego possesses an organization. Last time we saw that even the reduction of the negation bearing on what has been denied does not, for all that, render up to us, on behalf of the subject, his Beihang. One should take a close look at the value of the criteria we demand and on which we are, moreover, in agreement with the subject, in order to recognize a satisfactory Beihang. What is the source of the evidence? It is the analytic reconstruction that the subject must authenticate. The memory must be re-experienced with the help of empty spaces. And Freud quite rightly reminds us that we can never wholeheartedly trust memory. Agreed. From then on, what exactly are we satisfied with when the subject tells us that things have got to that clicking point where he has the feeling of truth? This question brings us to the heart of the problem of the feeling of reality, which I touched on the other day with respect to the genesis of the Wolfman's hallucination. I put forward the quasi-algebraic formula, which has the air of being almost too transparent, too concrete. The real, or what is perceived as such, is what resists symbolization absolutely. In the end, doesn't the feeling of the real reach its high point in the pressing manifestation of an unreal, hallucinatory reality? For the Wolfman, the symbolization of the meaning of the genital plane was verworfen. So should we be surprised that a number of interpretations, which are called interpretations of contents, are not symbolized by the subject? They manifest themselves at a stage when they cannot in any way make available to him the revelation of his situation within this forbidden territory that is his unconscious, insofar as they are still located in the plane of negation or in that of the negation of the negation. Something has not yet been got over, which is precisely beyond discourse, and which necessitates a jump in discourse. Repression cannot purely and simply disappear. It can only be gone beyond, in the sense of Aufhebung. What Anna Freud calls the analysis of the defenses against affect is only one step in her own understanding and not in that of the subject. Once she realizes that she is on the wrong track in believing that the subject's defense is a defense against herself, she can then analyze the resistance of the transference. Where does this lead her? To someone who isn't there, to a third party. She sifts out something that must greatly resemble Dora's position. The subject is identified with her father, and this identification has structured her ego. This structuration of the ego is here referred to as a defense. It is the most superficial aspect of identification, but one is able, through this shortcut, to make connection again with a deeper plane and to recognize the subject's position in the symbolic order. Nothing other than this is at stake in analysis. Recognizing what function the subject takes on in the order of the symbolic relations which covers the entire field of human relations, and whose initial cell is the Oedipus complex, where the assumption of sex is decided. Now I will let Mademoiselle Jalinier speak. She will get you to grasp Melanie Klein's point of view. This point of view is opposed to that of Anna Freud. It is not for nothing that these two ladies confronted each other in Merovingian rivalries, a situation not without parallel. Anna Freud's point of view is intellectualist and leads her into putting forward the view that everything in analysis must be conducted from a median, moderate position, which would be that of the ego. For her, everything starts with the education or the persuasion of the ego, and everything must come back to that. You are going to see the diametrically opposite starting point of Melanie Klein's approach to a particularly difficult subject, apropos of whom one may ask oneself how Anna Freud would have been able to make use of her categories of the strong ego and the weak ego, which presuppose a position of preliminary re-education. By the same token, you'll be able to judge which of the two is closer to the axis of the Freudian discovery. It is at this point that Jacques Lacan points us to Melanie Klein's article, and you probably should read it after you hear how the first paragraph begins in part 2. But the name of Melanie Klein's article is The Importance of Symbol Formation in the Development of the Ego, published in 1930. It is to be found in the writings of Melanie Klein, Volume 1, pages 219 to 232. Part 2. She slams the symbolism on him with complete brutality, does Melanie Klein, on little Dick. Straight away, she starts off hitting him large-scale interpretations. She hits him a brutal verbalization of the Oedipal myth, almost as revolting for us as for any reader. You are the little train. You want to fuck your mother. Quite clearly, this way of doing things leads to theoretical discussions which cannot be dissociated from a case diagnostic. But it is clear that as a result of this interpretation, something happens. Everything is there. You will have noticed the lack of contact that Dick experiences. That's where the defect of his ego is. His ego isn't formed. Moreover, Melanie Klein differentiates Dick from a neurotic by his profound indifference, his apathy, his absence. In fact, it is clear that, for him, what isn't symbolized is reality. This young subject is completely in reality, in the pure state, unconstituted. He is entirely in the undifferentiated. Now, what constitutes a human world? If not the interest brought to bear on objects as distinct entities or as equivalent ones, The human world is an infinite world as far as its objects are concerned. In this respect, Dick lives in a non-human world. This text is a precious one because it comes from a therapist, a woman of experience. She feels things. She expresses them badly. One cannot blame her for that. The theory of the ego is incomplete here, perhaps because she hadn't decided to provide one, but what she does show extremely well is the following. If, in the human world, objects become variegated, develop, with the luxuriance that makes for its originality, it is to the extent that they make their appearance within a process of expulsion linked to the instinct of primitive destruction. What is at issue here is a primitive relation. At the very root, the instinctual root of being. As these ejections out of the subject's primitive world each take place, a world which is not yet organized into the register of a properly human, communicable reality, so each time a new type of identification arises. That is what is insufferable, and anxiety arises simultaneously. Anxiety is not a sort of energy that the subject has to apportion out in order to constitute objects, and Melanie Klein's text does not include any turn of phrase which might be read in that way. Anxiety is always defined as appearing suddenly, as arising. To each of the objectal relations there corresponds a mode of identification of which anxiety is the signal. The identifications in question here precede the ego identification. But even when this latter will have been achieved, every new re-identification of the subject will cause anxiety to arise. Anxiety in the sense of its being a temptation, a giddiness, a loss of the subject as he finds himself at extremely primitive levels. Anxiety is a connotation, a signal, as Freud always very clearly formulated it, a quality, a subjective coloration. Now, this anxiety is exactly what is not generated in the subject in question. Dick cannot even engage in the very first sort of identification, which would already be an essay in symbolism. He is, paradoxical as it may seem to say it, eyeball to eyeball with reality. He lives in reality. In Melanie Klein's office, there is neither other nor ego for him, just a reality pure and simple. The space between the two doors is the body of his mother. The trains and all that is doubtless something, but something which is neither nameable nor named. It is at this point that Melanie Klein, with her animal instinct, which has moreover allowed her to bore through a body of knowledge which was up to then impenetrable, dares to speak to him, to speak to a being who nonetheless allows himself to be apprehended as someone who, in a symbolic sense of the term, does not reply. He is there as if she didn't exist, as if she were a piece of furniture, and yet she is speaking to him. She literally gives names to what doubtless does indeed partake in the symbol, since it can be named immediately, but which was, up to that moment, for this subject, just reality, pure and simple. That is what gives signification to the term prematuration, which she employs to say that Dick has already in some sense reached the genital stage. Normally, the subject finds for those objects of his primitive identification a series of imaginary equivalents which diversify his world. He draws up identifications with certain objects, withdraws them, makes them up again with others, etc. Each time anxiety prevents a definitive identification, the fixation of reality. But these comings and goings will give its framework to that infinitely more complex real, which is the human real. After this phase, in the course of which fantasies are symbolized, comes the so-called genital phase, in which reality is then fixed. Now, for Dick, reality is clearly fixed, but that's because he cannot undertake these comings and goings. He is immediately in a reality which knows no development. It is, however, not a completely dehumanized reality. It signifies, at its own level, It is already symbolized, since one can give it a meaning. But as it is above all a movement of coming and going, it only amounts to an anticipated, fixed symbolization with a single and unique primary identification with the following names: the void, the dark. This gap is precisely what is human in the structure peculiar to the subject, and that is what replies within him. He only makes contact with this gap. In this gap, he can count only a very limited number of objects, which he cannot even name, as you have already astutely noted. Certainly, he already has some sense of vocables, but to this vocables, he hasn't given a behang. He hasn't assumed them. At the same time, paradoxical as it may appear, a potentiality for empathy can be found in him, which is much greater than normal, because he is perfectly at ease in relation to reality, in a non-anxiogenic fashion. When he sees little pencil shavings on Melanie Klein's blouse, the result of a fragmentation, he says, "Poor Melanie Klein." Next time, we will take up the problem of the relation between the symbolic and the real from the most difficult angle, at its point of origin. You will see the connection with what we singled out the other day in Monsieur Hippolyte's commentary. The function of destructionism in the constitution of human reality. 17 February 1954.